Good afternoon, everyone. If you could please take your seats. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Warm welcome to the Maison de la Paix, for those of you who haven't been here before. It is my great pleasure to welcome you today to the fifth lecture in our series called Europe Tomorrow, which we organize in partnership with the EU delegation to the UN in Geneva. As an academic institution focusing on international relations, we believe it is vital that our student and also our regular public, those people who come regularly to our event, get access to Europe's greatest minds. And this lecture series is meant to do just that, stimulate the discussion on the future of Europe. I took a quick glance at the titles of some of our recent European-related lectures, and the mood would appear at first sight to be rather gloom. The EU in a global storm, that was the last one. Europe in crisis. Has Europe reached its limits? Yet I noted that all the speakers spoke to Europe's resilience at many different levels, whether internally and externally. So I'm really looking forward to hearing our speakers' views on that. The lecture has been made possible thanks to the permanent mission of Finland to the UN, and I would like now to ask Ambassador Hakala to join me on stage to present our speaker and say a few words about the subject of the lecture. Enjoy yourself.
Thank you very much, and good early afternoon, dear Excellencies, colleagues, and participants. Good to see so many of you here, even if I know that the timing is a bit challenging since it's a lunch break here. It's a great pleasure to invite you here today to this public lecture, Europe in the New World Order, with Mr. Alexander Stubb, or Alex Stubb, as we call him back in Helsinki. And as mentioned, this is co-organized in cooperation with my mission, Permanent Mission of Finland, Delegation of the European Union, and the Graduate Institute. We are living in a changing, unstable, and unpredictable world in which the liberal international order and multilateralism are being severely challenged. This is something we all experience here in Geneva on a daily basis, as you know. The changing landscape of international politics and power dynamics raises at least 3 questions. And I decided to raise only 3 questions because, as I happen to know, Alex Stubb's strong preference for 3 points. So, the 3 questions. Firstly, how this changing world order is affecting Europe and the European Union. Secondly, how the EU, in turn, is trying to shape the emerging new order by recalibrating its policies and actions in various domains, such as foreign and security policy, trade, migration, rule of law, climate change, populism, etc. And then thirdly, how can we answer to these global questions at times when multilateralism and international cooperation are increasingly challenged? These are the complex and multifaceted questions we are going to focus today. Luckily, we have an excellent speaker to share his vision on the current challenges Europe is facing and how Europe and the EU should provide solutions to some of these global concerns. And I have now honored to introduce Mr. Alex Stubb. I think, you know, for most of you, he doesn't need any introduction, but just to remind you, he's the current Vice President of the European Investment Bank and Chairman of the Board of Crisis Management Initiative, as well as the former Prime Minister, Finance Minister, and Minister of Foreign Affairs of Finland. He has been a member of the European Parliament from 2004 to 2008, a government minister from 2008 to 2016, chairperson of the National Coalition Party from 2014 to 16. But most importantly, and today, Mr. Stubb is an avid pro-European who has held several positions of responsibility. He knows the weight of the government, he knows European politics, and today we will hear his analysis on how this new world disorder is affecting Europe and the European Union. The session will be moderated by Dr. Erika Moret, who is a senior researcher at the Center for Global Governance of the Graduate Institute. With these remarks, I want to welcome you once more and hope to have a vivid discussion with you and with Alex Stubb and Dr. Erika Moret. You have the floor, Dr. Moret. Please, welcome all.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, and thank you for all of you for coming along today in spite of the terrible and very un-Swiss weather we're having. It's my great pleasure to be hosting today's talk by Alexander Stubb, and I'd like to extend a very warm welcome from the Global Governance Centre as well here at the Institute. Today's format will be a presentation from Alex, and following that, the two of us will have a conversation, and then I'll turn over to you in the audience for a Q&A, and we're aiming to finish by 2 p.m. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, and good afternoon to all of you. It's really nice to see you here. I was just reminded by Terhi's introduction that, when she said needs no introduction, Henry Kissinger was once introduced with those words, needs no introductions, and after that, of course, there was a long litany of his CV, and then he came up on stage and said, I might not need introductions, but I sure like listening to them. And I think he's right. I'm standing here probably in front of you today more as an academic and as an EU nerd. That's pretty much my background. I went to the College of Europe together with Carl. Not only found my wife there, but my career and life as well. And I ended up doing a PhD from the London School of Economics in differentiated integration, a really sexy subject in international relations, about the fact that not every EU member state needs to do everything at the same time. Now, today, as Terhi already alluded, I will be giving you an introduction, 3 points, and a conclusion with 3 pieces of advice for the European Union. And I think I'm pretty much like most of you in this room. I'm a typical liberal international. I believe that the best form of governance of society is based on liberal democracy, social market economy, and globalization. And probably like most of you, I'm a bit sort of scared at what happened in 2016 and what's going on in the world today. I'm very much a child of 1989. That's when I started studying in Greenville, South Carolina, Furman University. And that was, of course, as we just celebrated the downfall of the Berlin Wall. And I've been privileged enough to study and work in an open world, a world in which I felt, probably we felt, that everything was going in the right direction. And I would just like to say that even though the titles of the speeches that have been given in this lecture series, including mine, are a little bit alarmist, I want you to come away from this short talk with a sense of optimism. And I actually think that if we get it right, this is Europe's moment. And that will be my argument today. And don't despair. The EU is constant crisis management. We go from one crisis to another. Integration in one area leads to pressure to integrate in another. Sometimes the crisis is about oil, as it was in the 1970s. Sometimes it's about a dysfunctional single market, as it was in the 1980s. Sometimes it's about enlargement or the euro or institutions, as we had in the 1990s and 2000. The thing that distinguishes this time apart is that right now it is existential in many ways, and it's based on values. But I'll come back on that, and the 3 points I want to make today. First is to give you the historic perspective about 3 dates and 3 ideologies which I believe has led us to the situation in which we are today. Secondly, I will give you 3 consequences of date number 3, 2016. And then thirdly, I will give you 3 considerations or challenges that I feel that the European Union is amidst right now. And I'll wrap it all up by giving policy advice to the upcoming Commission whenever it is able to start. Here we go. Point number 1, 3 dates and 3 ideologies. My 3 dates, which I think have been game changers in international relations and especially in Europe, as we know. One is 1945, the second one is 1989, and the third one is 2016. Why? 1945, fairly self-evident. We lived in a world of 3 competing ideologies, which were capitalism, communism, and fascism. 1945 was the end of World War II, and also, hopefully, the end of fascism. And what emerged from the ashes of World War II was obviously a new world order, which was bipolar, surrounded by 2 ideologies, one led by the Soviet Union, authoritarianism, communism, controlled economies, and the other one led by the United States and the free world based on capitalism, for lack of a better term, and liberal democracy and freedom. It was also the beginning of multilateralism as we know it. Geneva is the haven of multilateral institutions, so I don't need to highlight them here. But that was when we kicked off the IMF. That's when we kicked off, in many ways, the UN as it stands today, NATO, the European Union, Bretton Woods, the World Bank, later on GATT and the WTO, and a whole regime of international rules and regulations, which I think we've had the privilege to either consolidate during the Cold War or then improve post the Cold War. But we went from a messy world to a fairly clear order, which was based on 2 poles, the Soviet Union and the United States. Then, of course, pretty much exactly 30 years ago, we enter into the second stage with 1989 and the downfall of the Berlin Wall. Communism crumbles a little bit slowly. The Soviet Union collapses in 1991. There is a feeling of rejuvenation, a feeling, in Fukuyama's terms, of end of history, where we felt that all of the 200 nation states in the world will start moving towards the ideal model of society: liberal democracy, social market economy, and globalization. And indeed, if we look at the early 1990s and going into 2000 plus, democracy was on the run. You know, early 20th century, we had 5 to 10 democracies. Early 21st century, you know, we had over 100. And this was the mega trend at the time. People in IR were excited. Of course, you had the classic fights between realists and institutionalists and the rest of it. But the bottom line was that there seems to be a good movement. Russia, for instance, a lot of people felt that it'll fall into place and become part of the democratic world order. There was rejuvenation with Václav Havel, with the freeing of Nelson Mandela. The whole mood was good. Am I trying to downplay the wars in the Balkans? No. Am I trying to downplay the difficulties of enlargement of the European Union or NATO? No. Am I trying to downplay the significance of Afghanistan or Iraq? No. But the bottom line is that the sentiment was very much, if I may, on our side. And of course, as I said, communism had died. We went towards a unipolar world, and multilateralism was still very, very strong. GATT moved into becoming the WTO, among others. Now, then the third date, I grapple with it, which one should I mention? But I use 2016 for 2 specific and in many ways symbolic and game-changing reasons. One is Brexit, and the other one is the election of Donald Trump. I could, of course, use other dates as well, which changed world politics. 9/11 the fight against terrorism, Afghanistan and Iraq in that world. I could use Lehman Brothers and the financial crisis. I could use the war in Georgia as the first portrayal of traditional power politics around the borders of Europe. I could use Ukraine. I could use the migration crisis. I could use the emergence of populism. All of these, in my mind, become one package, which is then symbolized in 2016. And in many ways, and I would say this as an Anglophile, the beginning of the voluntary marginalization of a Anglo-Saxon world order. Because of course the bottom line is that, you know, if you don't want to take charge of world politics, as the current US administration does not seem to be able or wanting to do, you cannot be a world leader. Similarly, if you decide to leave the single biggest multilateral institution and market of the world, namely the European Union, and claim that you could somehow have an impact after that in world politics, I mean, who are you fooling? It just ain't going to happen. Leaving the European Union is a little bit like leaving the internet. I mean, you can do it, but it's probably better to try to influence its content. Or perhaps not, depends of course on your view. But then the big question is, with these three dates, 1945, 1989 and 2016, what is going to happen next? Here's where I come to my second point today. I would argue that 2016 has three consequences, at least. But in order to keep track in my own head, I've defined them into three. The first consequence is emergence of power vacuums, because any time in geopolitics or in world politics someone leaves a stage open to someone else, a power vacuum emerges, and someone is going to start filling that vacuum. I'll just give you one simple example. Remember, Trump was elected in November 2016, and President Xi went to Davos in January 2017. Who was the big hero of multilateralism, free trade, and the fight against climate change? Suddenly it was China. So immediately someone was there to take that role. You can argue about the reasons, but I think it was obviously a very smart move. But I would argue that there are power vacuums emerging. One of them is on values. You know, who will fight for European, Western, or what I would call universal values of human rights, fundamental rights, freedom, democracy, and the rule of law. Second power vacuum is on trade. Who will fill that void? The WTO is trying to do that, but probably not with the success rate one would have wanted. And obviously the European Union is doing a darn good job with it, because what they're doing is creating new bilateral trade agreements worldwide when you see threats coming from, how would I say, irregular, unpredictable US trade behavior. Third power vacuum is on multilateralism. You know, who is going to be the one that fights for multilateralism? Not an easy job to do in today's world. A fourth power vacuum is on climate. Who's going to take that road? A fifth power vacuum potentially is currency. What's going to be the strongest currency in the world? So a lot of power vacuums and jostling around. And that's why I would argue that we live in a world of disorder, because these power vacuums haven't been settled yet. I don't know who's going to take what, when, where, and how. The second consequence of 2016 is geopolitics. And geopolitics broadly defined. In my mind, geopolitics obviously has been a power game between big states, quite traditionally. But right now we're looking at a transactional world where it seems to be okay to do haphazard, almost spontaneous deals. The way in which the US administration, especially President Trump, sees the world is very transactional, doing deals left and right. I just had the, I say this diplomatically, privilege to listen to Nikki Haley on Monday in London. And I was reminded of President George W. Bush's reaction to President Trump's inauguration speech. when you could read from his lips after the speech, looking at Condoleezza Rice or Hillary Clinton saying that was some weird shit. And to be quite honest, I think when we look at this transactional world of international relations, it is some weird shit. I've never been able to see relations between nation states as pure transactions or business-like deals, but this seems to be the red thread, or at least the Twitter behavior of some of the political leaders globally today. In geopolitics, there also seems to be a very strong national undercurrent, which obviously is in many ways rather paradoxical. We live in a much more global world, much more interdependent world, but a lot of the undercurrent and the narrative that we're seeing is people turning domestic. And it's very much become identity politics, which was Fukuyama's sort of follow-up book to The End of History, that we're starting to define ourselves through identities. And here I don't necessarily mean the clash of civilizations type of approach, but the fact that we're starting to get afraid of a world which is so big and so complex that we turn back to our roots, and that we can see in a lot of local and national politics today. And the third geopolitical consequence in this is something that the European Union must start understanding, that geopolitics is not about economics and soft power and economic might. It's also about politics. And we start seeing economic diplomacy used in a different kind of a way, whether it's with trade deals or sanctions or trade barriers between China and the US, whether it's about mergers and acquisitions in Europe with companies. I'll just give you one example. I wrote an FT piece in 2016 with the title, "For China, Europe is the New Africa." And the argument, slightly provocative, was that what China was doing to natural resources in Africa, it was doing to patents and IPOs, intellectual property, and technology here in Europe. And it's not a question of going knee-jerk protectionist, but it's a question of understanding that security is becoming more economic as well. So power vacuums 1, geopolitics 2, and then number 3, this is my perhaps slightly naive wish or argument. I think we're seeing the emergence of 3 power blocks fighting for these spaces. Power block number 1 is the EU, if it can get its act together. Power block number 2 is self-evident, the United States. And power block number 3 is China. Right now, my feeling is that the 2 predominant power blocks are China and the United States, whether it's about security, whether it's about military, whether it's about economic clout and power. But don't count the European Union out. And I'm not saying this only because I think that the European Union is the greatest regulatory superpower in the world. But you will start seeing, I think, more, superpower type of behavior by the European Union than you have seen previously. Whether it's about attacking big technology, whether it's about what I will talk about in a second, autonomy or strategic autonomy, strategic sovereignty, we're going to start seeing a slightly different European Union if it starts getting its act together. Now, you'll probably look at me and say, Alex, you're from Finland, 1,300 kilometers of border with Russia. Why don't you mention them? Well, of course, in the security, political, or military field, Russia is big. But in economic terms, it's not. In terms of innovation, in terms of traditional economy, it is not. But in terms of being a player in, for instance, Syria, Turkey, wherever, we will start, of course, seeing a more assertive Russia. So 3 consequences: power vacuums, geopolitics, and power blocks with the EU, China, and the US. My third and final point is not only for academics and researchers in the room, but also for EU ambassadors, diplomats, and policymakers, is 3 considerations or challenges that I see the European facing at the moment. One of them is internal, The next one is external, and the third one is global. The internal ones are quite simple. They are linked to Brexit, which in my mind is still, no matter how Brexit fatigued we are, an existential challenge for the European Union, because for the first time, I say this hesitantly, potentially we have a member state leaving the European Union. I don't think it's in the bank yet, but potentially it is leaving, and we have seen the mayhem that it has caused in the past 3 years. If you want to see the silver lining, we have the biggest pro-European movements in the history of the European Union taking place right now. Paradoxically, they are in the United Kingdom, but nevertheless, they are there. And if you look at the approval ratings of the European Union, they're much higher than what they were pre-Brexit. So one could say that this has had some good elements to it. With this internal problem comes also an attack on values, and especially from inside some of the member states and some of the governments and some of the populist movements that we have at the moment. And of course, the classic internal challenge constantly is economic low growth rates, albeit 7 consecutive years of economic growth post financial crisis. The second external challenge or consideration for the European Union is, what do we want to do with the US? What do we want to do with China? And what do we want to do with Russia? And these are obviously enormous strategic questions. My value base says, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater with the United States. That is still our fundamental value base, whether it's constitutional or historic. Secondly, my argument is not to reject China, because my sentiment right now is that for 20 years we went, yeah, China opening up. Let's do trade, let's liberalize, let's work on it. And now suddenly everyone's saying, whoa, China is becoming a threat. Belt and Road is awful. Let's be careful here. So don't do exactly the opposite. Don't reject China. And my third recommendation to the EU is that have a dialogue with Russia. I know it's extremely difficult with breaking international law, moving borders, Crimean Peninsula, Ukraine, and the rest of it. But dialogue must continue with Russia. We cannot isolate Russia, because that's when Russia becomes fundamentally dangerous. The third consideration, apart from internal, external, is global, and this is classic. How do we deal with climate change? How do we deal with trade? And how we deal with multilateralism? And I'll conclude and then go to the Q&A and the dialogue by making the argument that I actually think that this is potentially Europe's moment. And the choice is quite simple. Either we can turn inward, as some people suggest, or we can open up and turn outward. Of course, the option is there also to do nothing, but I don't think that's possible. My fear is that a lot of countries are starting to turn inward. They're starting to make politics more national and more local. And they jump on the populist bandwagon and try to become more populist than the populists themselves. And I don't think that's a good remedy. I don't think it's a good recipe. My hope is that Europe will turn outward and outbound. It's not an easy task to do at the moment. We're seeing very messy election results everywhere. And I don't have the magic potion for this and how it's going to be done, but I do believe that something will have to be done. My 3 policy recommendations, which I finish off with, are the following. Number 1, I think actually the EU needs to focus on something that has been called strategic sovereignty or strategic autonomy. And this doesn't mean protectionism, quite the contrary. Some of you who know me in this room, I'm a raving liberal when it comes. I'm not a big fan of European industrial policy and the rest of it. But I do admit, and I give the fact that, if there are certain rules of the game in geopolitics, we have to play that game. We cannot be naive. There will be moments when we have to act fully in our own European economic interests, whether it's on the economy, whether it's on security, and whether it's on technology. So the commission that we now have, it has taken us as one of its red threads to be a geopolitical commission and to focus on more strategic sovereignty, and I think that's a good thing. Number two, I still think that someone needs to defend what I call decent values. Human rights, fundamental rights, equal rights, democracy, the rule of law, freedom. You know, you can't take them from granted. Yeah, John Locke might have written about them in the 1700s, and life, liberty, and the pursuit of property, he actually said at the time. But we can't take these for granted or given. We've seen that in the history of Europe and the history of the world as well. And these values are being attacked from outside the European Union, whether it's rather bizarre behavior by the US administration, whether it's Russia, Putin sort of clapping his hands and smiling by the chaos that has been caused in Europe and elsewhere, or whether it's from China, which has a completely different model of society than we do. Someone needs to defend these values, because they've worked very well for us over the past century, and they shall continue to work well for us. And the third piece of advice or policy recommendation I would give to the European Union is to defend multilateralism. We're pretty good at it, you know. If we have three models of society, China is a centralized state with an authoritarian regime and a clear command structure. The United States is very bipolar, you know, Republican, Democratic, or sometimes something in between. The EU and the European Union is basically by definition multilateral. It's by definition messy. It's by definition a compromise. So we know how to deal in this space, and therefore I would argue that it's very important that we also defend it. So here, ladies and gentlemen, are some of my thoughts, and this is very much work in progress. I'm actually starting slowly to work on a book to try to make sense of the world disorder. I'm not there yet. But what I am arguing that the big game here is, number one, that we have 3 dates which have defined what we are as a European Union and as Europeans: 1945, 1989, and potentially 2016. And I also make an argument, number 2, that we have 3 consequences: the emergence of power vacuums, geopolitics, and potentially 3 power blocks. And I also claim that we do have 3 challenges, one of them being internal, a second one external, and the last one global. I leave you with an optimistic note. Sometimes we have a tendency to over-exaggerate the moment, and the human mind is such that we forget the past and think that everything that is catastrophic and crisis is now. Yeah, it's a tough time, there's no question about it. But democracies have a tendency to rectify themselves, to correct the move, and then continue onwards. And at the end of the day, I don't think Europe has ever been in better shape than what it is right now. If you look at it from a perspective of economic growth, if you look at it from a perspective of wealth, or if you look at it from a perspective of freedom. And I hope that I can be here in 10 years and say exactly the same thing. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alex, for that incredibly insightful talk. I think you've helped us think of a couple more foreboding titles for some of the future lectures. I've come up with 2 here. Can the EU get its act together? And there's weird shit going on in Europe. So I'd like to start on a personal point, if I may. I think because we have obviously a lot of students here today, I'd like to know, how did you go from an academic and an EU nerd to where you are today with, if I may say so, an incredibly shining CV, and I, for one, am incredibly jealous and intimidated by the fact you've already written something like 40 books. You've been prime minister. You've held various ministerial positions and so on. So what advice can you give in terms of the students who are here today who might be inspired by your career to date?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the lifeline is to stay curious and open. You know, when I was a kid, I wanted to become a professional sportsman, first in ice hockey and then in golf, and I sucked at both, so I didn't. And then I got extremely inspired by the world of academia. Actually, at Furman University in Greenville, South Carolina, I went there to study business and play golf, and I ended up studying political science and quitting golf and not understanding accounting. So, I also never probably meant to go into civil service, which was my next step, but I felt that at the time in the 1990s there was so much interesting stuff going on. And Finland joined the European Union, and I'd done a lot of academic work around that and around flexible integration, differentiated integration, and the rest of it. And I was really inspired by intergovernmental conferences and negotiations for big treaties. So I thought, I want to be part of I know it's a bit
Definitely
weird, isn't it? It's
nerd.
really nerdy, yeah. And especially the institutional aspects of it. So I wanted to, have an impact on that. And then after a few years, I noticed that, being a civil servant and having done academia was a wonderful combo because, you had the theoretical framework and then you had the policy framework, but it was still limiting in the sense that I couldn't express myself, fully. And then I just joined my party in 2004 and went into the European Parliament elections, and we don't have lists, and because I had been the sort of EU nerd of the country, I, by a mishap of democracy, got elected. And the rest of it is history. But in careers, there's also a big element of slump. I'll just give you one example. I never intended to go into domestic politics, but because of a scandal of a predecessor foreign minister of mine, I got called in with 24 hours notice with a question, can you become foreign minister in 2008? And the rest was history. So my advice to students is to have an open mind, be curious, and then let things happen. I think with careers, a lot of times it's about luck. You work hard, but it's lucky as well.
Thank you. This morning you were in the Palais des Nations talking about technology and peace, which I understand is one of your topics that you're focusing on a lot at the moment. And also, of course, technology is one of the areas in the EU that is often said could be an area for leadership and so on. I think in an essay in around 2016, you spoke about cyborgs and about that hazy interaction between human beings and technology. As a consequence of some of this work that you've been doing, are you worried that some are weaponizing our connectivity, be it in terms of fake news, trolls, deep fakes, and so on? And if so, what would your recommendation be and how we can better tackle it?
Probably the subject of a new lecture, if you will. I guess my first take on it is that I think that artificial intelligence and robotization, or the digital revolution, the fourth industrial revolution, whatever you want to call the baby, it will change the economy and the way in which we work. It already has. Secondly, it'll change politics and the way in which we communicate. It already has. And then thirdly, it'll change science and, at the end of the day, what we are as human beings. I would argue that we are not necessarily cyborgs yet, but we certainly are hybrids. I don't know if any of you can live without a smartphone anymore today, and the simple example that I give is that, what's the first thing you do when you wake up in the morning and the last thing you do when you go to bed at night? Is it your smartphone, or is it a kiss and a hug to your spouse? And everyone, you don't need to get personal here, so I don't, but the bottom line is that I at least find myself extremely, scared and intimidated with the fact that I cannot live without this anymore. And in that sense, there's a clear connection between my brain and whichever gadget I have at hand. Now, will this be a force for good or a force for bad? I don't know. I think technology should always be seen as an instrument, a gadget to improve mankind. And I think it's doing that. In terms of peace and technology, the subject we discussed this morning, my take is quite simple. We can use technology for the advantage or disadvantage of peace. Advantage, try to sort out the type of language and algorithms that a peace negotiation or mediation needs, or try to detect a crisis spot with algorithms, movements happening in a certain region in the world. Fine. Disadvantage, the use of language, the way in which we amplify and simplify things. or the use of, for instance, intimidation in Catalonia, fake news and the like. So it's a very uneasy balance to deal with, but we have to understand that the line between war and peace nowadays is blurred. Traditional warfare is not as beneficial as it used to be, land acquisition or other things. It's more beneficial to intimidate, to attack energy sources, to attack banking systems, to troll and to fake and so on and so forth. So it's a very interesting, time to try to be a peace mediator as well. But what humans start, humans can end. So I think we should always go with the human perspective first.
Thanks. Well, moving on to staying with the theme of peace and moving on to a wider question of foreign policy. There's obviously a new leadership team taking office in Brussels. Something I read in the FT a couple of days ago said that if the bloc's common foreign policy is to command respect, the first place where it must achieve success is in Europe's neighbourhood. In another article, the commentator very scathingly said that the EU has a near irrelevance in Syria, for example, which obviously is one of the most pressing and tragic humanitarian and conflict situations in our region and in the world today. What would your advice be to the EU in terms of how to go about starting a new phase of foreign policy, particularly with regard to Syria?
Yeah. Well, first of all, we probably need to reduce our expectations, because usually we are with European foreign policy in a situation whereby there are high expectations and low outcome. And you also have to pick your battles. So, for instance, I think the European Union did the right thing in Iran. It saw that this is an opportunity for us to negotiate, and it brokered the deal and had a real impact. Should we be present everywhere, in Syria? Should we be present in the Middle East? Should we be present in Afghanistan? Should we look at some of the African conflicts? I really don't know, but I think if I were in the Commission or High Rep, I would pick my battles, take a few of them. I like the general sense that von der Leyen is pushing, in other words, that this is a geopolitical commission, and hopefully it can have an impact. To come back to your first point from the FT, that we need to have respect in our neighborhood, well then, to be honest, I think we, or in this particular instance, with all due respect, the President of France did a colossal strategic mistake by not allowing the accession negotiations to begin with Albania and North Macedonia. I mean, this is our near neighborhood. And I don't care what the reasons are. This was simply a mistake. And hopefully we can rectify this mistake sooner rather than later. Because at the end of the day, it's about winning over hearts and minds. And the question is, if you're Albanian, if you're from North Macedonia and you do get a cold shoulder from the European Union, where do you go? You probably go to Russia. And I wouldn't warmly recommend that. So I think we have a lot of work to do. At the same time, if you look at the pioneers, of course, were Javier Solana and then Cathy Ashton and Mogherini. Borrell doesn't have an easy task. He's pretty much at the mercy of the member states, and his room of maneuver is usually quite limited. But if we can agree on a few key points where Europe can have a value added, I think that would be already a step forward. What it can do, however, is to start using the economy, trade, competition, regulation in a more strategic way.
I think that reminds me of something else you wrote, where you said money should get a Nobel Prize or something like that.
I guess it's the banker in me now. Money is a wonderful form of exchange, but it doesn't have a very good name.
Okay, well, I have a few more questions, but seeing that we were trying to stick to 3, and given the time, I'll park my questions for another time and open to the floor and invite any questions. If you put your hand up, and also if you wouldn't mind saying your name and institution. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm Michael Ungarn-Sternbeck, the German ambassador to the UN in Geneva. Mr. Stubb, you spoke about Europe getting their act together. Could you be more concrete on that? There are some, just to take 2 examples, migration. We have very different points of view on migration. It is a fundamental issue, of course, for the relation between Europe and neighboring states. And even in Scandinavia, you don't have a single view on migration, let alone the split between some of the Central European countries and Western European countries. And now we see a split between the Southern European countries and some of the countries in the North. So is there a method conceivable to join forces on that? We had one vote in the Council that was taken with qualified majority. In the end, it wasn't implemented. So all of this demonstrates how difficult it is. Second issue, the Eurozone. Everybody knows there's a problem in bringing the economies closer together. One of the issues is, and I think President Macron brought that up, creating a big fund that will facilitate countries that are in a crisis, that are in a different place in the cycle, the economic cycle. Yet, once again, there are very different views among different countries. So how does the European Union get its act together, to use your words?
Well, I think you sort of answered the question. My point was exactly that unless we have a common approach to a few of the key issues, it's very difficult to get the act together. If you look at the division inside the European Union, of course I'm simplifying now, you clearly have a north-south divide when it comes to the development of the Eurozone, and that stems from the financial, come sovereign debt, come Euro crisis, come the bailout, banking union in its three different phases, and this has been very much about, you know, austerity versus jobs and control and the rest of it. So that's the north-south divide, the Hansa League versus the rest. And then you have an east-west divide, which is linked to migration. And sometimes it's also linked to climate. And what I find interesting in this, I mean, you mentioned migration as a sort of a point that divides the European Union. Yes, to a certain extent. But I think that if we don't get the climate change issue right and make an impact on that, and if and when the population of Africa by the end of the century will be 4 billion, halfway through the century 2 billion, 2015 will be just a walk in the park in comparison, because, you know, people have the access to seeing what a better life looks like over their mobile phones. And as human beings, we always want to have a good life. And if we don't get our act together on climate, on migration, we're not going to manage. My final point is on the economy and the development of the Eurozone. I think that, and having done intergovernmental conferences, 4 of them, I think the biggest, and there are other people who've done IGCs here as well, I think the biggest changes come through crisis. If someone would have told me in 2009 that we have 2-pack legislation, that we have 6-pack legislation, that we have a banking union which is 2.5 steps there, a resolution mechanism to stability mechanism, to the first steps of a banking union without a deposit guarantee, I would say, you know, dream on, it ain't gonna happen. And of course, in 2014 and 2015, we had that. So I think the European integration process is incremental. You know, integration in one area leads to pressure to integrate in another. So therefore, at the end of the day, we will see a banking union. And I don't say that just because the finance minister of Germany wrote a piece about it in the Financial Times yesterday.
Thank you. My name is Cecilia Pelosniemi. I work for UN Women around the peace talks for Syria. And my question relates to civil society. You mentioned all these power brokers. We all know who they are in the context of Syria. And we also know that the constitutional process is currently ongoing here in Geneva. And the Syrians are extremely concerned that they are not going to have a say in the constitutional process, and that these values of freedom or democracy or human rights or gender equality are going to be in the constitution also, because we have a certain number of power brokers that are not really in favor of such values. You're the head of a peace mediation organization, and I'm wondering, what role do you see for civil society in the future, and also how the EU can support these kinds of values through civil society, maybe, when we have actors that are not necessarily too much in favor of them?
I guess the short answer is I see a big role for civil society, and I guess I can say this with a certain sentiment of experience. I had the opportunity as foreign minister and then chairman of the OSCE to broker peace together with then Ambassador Hakala. in the war in Georgia. And that was very much traditional peace mediation. We needed to come up with a ceasefire in a few days. We flew in then together with Foreign Minister Bernard Kouchner, put a 5-point plan on how to muster the peace process, and then within 4 days we were able to calm the situation down. Now, that's traditional peace mediation and peace brokering. But in these long-term conflicts, which don't sort of happen just quickly and are over quickly, it's all about trust. It's all about involvement of the different stakeholders. It's all about implementation. And if you don't have a broader negotiating table, broader civil society involved, it's not going to work. And in our experience, we're involved in about 25 active conflicts at the moment at the Crisis Management Initiative. It's not anymore so much about, with all due respect, old men sitting around a peace mediation table and signing an agreement and saying, here is peace. No, it's about getting society more broadly involved in that peace negotiation. And also at the end of the day, it's about education. I'm not good enough to give you a remark on Syria. You're involved in those negotiations, including the constitution, but I guess the constitution should be something which is not juxtaposed from above. It needs to be something which is, emerges from underneath.
Thank you. My name is Zhong Yan from the World Intellectual Property Organization. And thank you, Prime Minister, for your speech. Very inspiring, very interesting. And my question is regarding to the IP. So yesterday, regarding the intellectual property, we learned from the news that yesterday, during the visit of President Emmanuel Macron, EU and China signed an agreement on the geographical indication. And according to that agreement, I think we've learned that the goods like Parma cheese or champagne can be sold exclusively in China, in China's market. So, in your view, what's the potential of, the cooperation and interaction between the EU and China in this kind of area? For example, the under discussion, the EU and China investment agreement, and also in IP. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Great. I guess just one first remark is that President Macron does not negotiate European trade policy. That is the exclusive competence of the European Commission and whoever is a trade commissioner at the time. Now, I haven't looked at the details of the agreement that was discussed or came through yesterday, and sometimes perhaps the way in which things are conveyed in media is not very clear or always exact. But my take on EU-China relations is that we have to have close relations with China, but there are going to be colossal issues to be solved before that. Intellectual property, IPO, patents, investment are there probably in line before we can get into serious discussions about a free trade area. Of course, if at one stage we could be able to forge a free trade area between China and the European Union, that would be phenomenal. Extremely good as well. But there are some serious issues to overcome before that. Then we would have the biggest trading bloc in the world, in other words, the European Union, linked to the second or third biggest, and that would be quite useful. But what I'm really afraid of is that some European leaders want to turn extremely protectionist when it comes to China, and I don't think that's a good idea. I think we have to be careful with issues such as Ekstron, when no one seemed to know that a Chinese company, the background of which we did not know very well, was acquiring a German company which had some intelligence information, military information. So we have to be sort of alert on that kind of stuff. But it's going to be a long road. It's not necessarily a good thing for multilateralism, because we're not dealing with this stuff in the WTO. But bilateral trade agreements are probably the way of the future. Couple of laptops there. Oh, it doesn't matter.
Hi, my name is Jake Sanders. I'm a master's student at the University of Geneva doing political science. One thing that you said really stood out to me before. You said that you were a child of 1989. I'm from the UK and I was a child during the 2016 referendum. For me, I understand that you're advocating for larger EU engagement in the world. For example, that you said that if the EU gets its act together, we could expect greater participation, France and Germany, and we could also potentially be looking at an EU army, and that's one of the proposals I believe is out there. I would just like to maybe ask you, what would you say then to, for example, when I grew up during the referendum, I can offer my perspective is that the UK, unfortunately, a lot of people felt that there was too much EU involvement. And there's a fear of this big, scary, bloated bureaucracy in Brussels. That was the unfortunate image that was represented. So what would you then say, for example, to the idea that the EU needs to get its act together in terms of managing its own environment for the moment, not overextending, and that the next commission should really be aware of managing its own environment before it wants to promote itself. And also, for example, the talks with the extension talks. I might say that, for example, with the immigration issue, if the EU wants to repair its image in many ways to skeptical citizens around the EU, it should think about maybe scaling back some of those talks for now, but obviously keeping them on the table, because we know that influence is everything in geopolitics.
Yeah, no, I think you're touching all the right points and the right questions. I guess my first observation about the UK, and believe me, as I said, I'm married to a Brit. My wife, my children have dual nationality. I'm an avid Anglophile, and the last thing I wanted to see was Brexit. I think domestically in the UK, the biggest problem, I'll be very frank with you, has been the British media for the past 40 years, plus years. If the storyline of the tabloid press is simply that the EU sucks, and it comes from morning to night, including, Daily Telegraph columns by correspondent Boris Johnson from Brussels in the 1990s to 2000s about cucumbers and the rest of it. People are going to take that at the end of the day as okay, the EU sucks. And there was always this sort of feeling of the UK being a reluctant bride, if you will, not wanting to be part of it. At the same time, I think the UK has been a great force when it comes to economic liberalization, economic reform, the internal market inside the European Union. Now, the big question is then, what next? I was on stage on Tuesday morning with Tony Blair in London, discussing the subject, and which is always a pleasure. My take from the beginning has been that it's a bigger thing to leave the European Union than to join the European Union. And obviously, the Brexit referendum in 2016 was basically a debate on the surface and based a lot of it on fake news, on immigration and on others. But as you said, a perception was there. Now, I think it would be only fair to organize a second referendum which puts together, on one hand, the choice of current membership, and on the other hand, the choice of the New Deal, the withdrawal agreement. And then that would be the final say in it. Will this happen or not? Well, that depends on the election result. If it's a hung parliament, there is a potential, because I assume that in that case you will have either Labour or the Lib Dems in that coalition with the Conservatives. And they will have as one of their conditions a second referendum. Whether it'll take place or not, I don't know. My final point on this, I think you hit the right points about the EU and perhaps sometimes excessive regulation and so on and so forth. It's not, the more political the EU gets, the less loved it's going to be. It's just the way in which things go, at the end of the day. But the first question that we got today was, well, how does the EU get its act together? Well, take an example of the act together on the Brexit negotiations. I mean, hands down, it's been the best job the European Union has done in negotiations in ages. Completely unified 27, great leadership by Michel Barnier and the Commission, the guardian of the treaties. And, I'm not putting winners or losers in the negotiations, but, it's not exactly that the UK has gotten what it's wanted. And of course, that's when you leave a club, you can't do that. But this is an example of the EU at its best. When we come together, we have a common purpose. And I also think it's great that it's been impossible, even for the worst tabloid press, to put the blame on the EU for the Brexit negotiations. They've tried, but it just, it's echoing to hollow ears, huh?
Thank you. I'm afraid, I'm sure we could keep talking all afternoon and have plenty more questions, but time is up, unfortunately. I'd like to conclude with one of your phrases, which is that biggest change comes through crisis. And I do hope that for Europe, that change will be for the good. And we will very much look forward to following your progress in the future, politically, literarily, and in a sporting sense as well, I expect. So I would like to, on behalf of the Graduate Institute, the Mission of Finland, and the EU delegation to Geneva, I'd like to thank you very much for coming today. We really appreciate your insights and thoughts. Thank you.